The morning mist clung to the Belgian countryside like a funeral shroud, and through it came the low rumble that every German tanker had learned to distinguish from thunder. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter pressed his eye against the periscope of his Tiger I, watching the fog swirl across the frost-covered fields beyond Bastogne. December 1944 had brought more than winter. It had brought desperation. "Movement at 2 o'clock, whispered Friedrich Hans Weber from the driver's position, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air inside the tank. The Tiger's thick steel walls did little to keep out the Belgian cold, and less still to keep out the growing certainty that this war was slipping through their fingers like sand. Klaus adjusted the focus on his scope, squinting through the gray dawn light. There, a flash of olive drab moving between the skeletal remains of what had once been an apple orchard. American armor, no doubt about it. But what kind? The intelligence briefings had been increasingly unreliable lately, filled with contradictions and gaps that left tank crews guessing at what they might face in the field. "I see them," Klaus murmured, his gloved hand moving to the commander's override. "4 vehicles, low profile. Tank destroyers, I think." His gunner, Unteroffizier Friedrich Hoffmann, shifted in his seat below. Friedrich had been with the unit since North Africa, had seen Stukas dive-bomb British crusaders in the desert, had watched Tiger tanks tear through Soviet T-34s at Kursk. But there was something different in his voice now, a thread of uncertainty that hadn't been there in the early days. "Range?" Friedrich asked, his eye already pressed to the gunner's sight. 800 meters in closing." Klaus felt the familiar weight of command settle on his shoulders. At 23, he was older than most tank commanders in what remained of the Panzer forces, a survivor of campaigns that had claimed so many of his comrades that their names blurred together in his memory like faces in old photographs. The Tiger I was a magnificent machine, 60 tons of German engineering that had once struck fear into Allied tank crews from the steppes of Russia to the bocage of Normandy. Its 88mm gun could penetrate any tank the Allies fielded, and its thick armor had turned aside countless rounds from American 75mm guns and British 6-pounders. Klaus had seen Sherman tanks burning like torches after a single hit from their main gun, had watched enemy crews bail out of their vehicles rather than face a Tiger in open combat. But intelligence reports had been filtering down through command channels, whispers of new American tank destroyers with heavier guns. The M10 Wolverine with its 3-inch gun had proven troublesome but manageable. The M18 Hellcat was fast but lightly armored. What concerned Klaus more were the rumors of something new, something the Americans had been keeping quiet about. "They're spreading out," Hans observed, his hands steady on the controls despite the tension in his voice. The Tiger's Maybach engine idled with a deep, throaty rumble that Klaus knew could be heard for kilometers on a quiet morning like this. Stealth was not one of the Tiger's strengths. Klaus studied the approaching vehicles through his periscope. They looked different from the tank destroyers he had encountered before, bulkier somehow, with what appeared to be larger gun mantlets. The lead vehicle moved with the confident swagger of a machine whose crew knew something their opponents didn't. "Friedrich, load armor-piercing," Klaus ordered, his voice carrying the calm authority that had kept his crew alive through 3 years of war. "Hans, prepare to move on my command. We'll hit the lead vehicle first, then back into the tree line." It was a standard Tiger tactic, one that had served them well countless times before. Use the superior range and penetrating power of the 88mm to engage at distance, then reposition before return fire could find its mark. The Tiger's armor was thick, but Klaus had learned not to trust in steel alone. Too many good crews had died because they believed their own propaganda about invincibility. The radio crackled to life, the voice of his platoon commander cutting through the static. "Sturm 1, this is Sturm Lead. Do you have visual contact with enemy armor?" Klaus keyed his throat microphone. "Sturm Lead, Sturm 1. 4 enemy tank destroyers bearing 090, range 750 meters and closing. Engaging now." Understood, Sturm 1. Be advised we've lost contact with Sturm 3. Last transmission indicated they were engaging enemy armor near Hill 117. Klaus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Sturm 3 was commanded by his friend Erich Müller, a Bavarian farm boy who could hit a target at 1,000 meters in a snowstorm. If Erich's crew had gone silent, these Americans were more dangerous than they appeared. Target acquired, Friedrich reported from below, his voice tight with concentration. Lead vehicle, range 700 meters. Klaus took one last look through his periscope, noting the way the American vehicles moved with practiced coordination. These weren't green crews fresh from training camps in Georgia or Texas. These were veterans, men who had learned their trade in the crucible of combat, just as he had. Fire, Klaus commanded. The Tiger's 88mm gun spoke with a voice like thunder, the massive recoil rocking the 60-ton tank backward on its suspension. Klaus watched through his periscope as the armor-piercing round streaked across the misty battlefield, expecting to see the familiar sight of an American vehicle erupting in flames. Instead, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The round struck the lead tank destroyer's frontal armor at an oblique angle and ricocheted harmlessly into the sky, leaving nothing but a bright scar on the steel. "Impossible!" Friedrich breathed, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. Klaus blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him. No American tank destroyer had armor thick enough to deflect an 88mm round at that range. The M10 Wolverine had barely an inch of frontal armor. The M18 Hellcat was even more lightly protected. What were these machines? Before he could voice his confusion, the lead American vehicle rotated its turret with mechanical precision, and Klaus found himself staring down the barrel of what looked like a gun far larger than anything he'd seen mounted on an Allied tank destroyer. "Mein Gott!" Hans whispered. "Look at the size of that gun!" Klaus was looking, and what he saw defied everything he thought he knew about American armor. The barrel that swung toward them was massive, easily matching the caliber of their own 88mm gun, possibly exceeding it. Intelligence had said nothing about the Americans fielding tank destroyers with guns that large. "Hans, reverse! Get us back into the trees!" The Tiger's transmission engaged with a mechanical whine, and the massive tank began backing toward the cover of the forest. But even as they moved, Klaus kept his eye pressed to the periscope, watching as the American gun settled on target with the smooth precision of a machine operated by experts. The muzzle flash from the American tank destroyer was like a camera bulb exploding in the morning mist, brilliant white light that seemed to illuminate every detail of the battlefield with stark clarity. Klaus had a brief moment to register the size of the projectile streaking toward them, longer and heavier than any anti-tank round he'd ever seen, before it struck the Tiger's frontal armor with the force of a falling star. The sound was indescribable, a combination of tearing metal and explosive thunder that seemed to come from inside Klaus's bones. The Tiger shuddered like a living thing in pain, and through the suddenly cracked vision blocks, Klaus saw something that should have been impossible. A hole punched clean through the Tiger's 100mm frontal armor plate, the edges glowing cherry red from the heat of passage. "We're penetrated!" Friedrich screamed, his voice rising above the mechanical chaos erupting inside the fighting compartment. Sparks cascaded from severed electrical cables, and the acrid smell of burning rubber and hot metal filled the air. Klaus felt the Tiger lurch as Hans threw it into reverse, the driver's instincts overriding conscious thought in his desperation to get them away from whatever had just punched through their impenetrable armor like it was made of tin. But even as they backed toward the trees, Klaus could see the other American vehicles repositioning, their guns swiveling to track the retreating German tank. "Bail out!" Klaus shouted, his training overcoming the shock of seeing his invincible Tiger defeated by an enemy weapon that wasn't supposed to exist. "Abandon tank! Move! Move! Move!" Hans was already throwing open his driver's hatch, rolling out onto the engine deck in a practiced motion that spoke of too many close calls. Friedrich hesitated for a moment. Gunners always hated abandoning their weapons, before following suit through the turret escape hatch. Klaus grabbed the signal pistol and his map case, then hauled himself up and out of the commander's cupola just as a second American round struck the Tiger's turret ring. The impact sent him tumbling from the tank's hull, and he hit the frozen ground hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs. Rolling behind the bulk of his dying Tiger, Klaus watched as flames began to lick around the engine compartment. The fuel tanks would go soon, turning 60 tons of German steel into a funeral pyre. But his mind wasn't on the loss of his tank. It was on the weapon that had destroyed it so effortlessly. "What kind of gun was that?" Friedrich asked, crawling up beside him. The gunner's face was streaked with blood from a cut over his left eye, but his expression was one of professional fascination rather than fear. "That wasn't a 3-inch gun. That wasn't anything we've seen before." Klaus shook his head, watching as the American tank destroyers advanced cautiously across the battlefield. Now that he could see them clearly, he realized they were different from every Allied armored vehicle he'd encountered. Bulkier than the Wolverine, more heavily armored than the Hellcat, and mounting guns that looked suspiciously like
90 millimeters, he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. They're mounting 90-millimeter guns. Hans crawled up beside them, his uniform torn and his hands bloody from his hasty exit. Impossible! Intelligence said the Americans were still using 76-millimeter guns at most. Klaus watched as one of the American vehicles stopped beside the burning hulk of his Tiger, its crew probably as surprised as he was by how easily their new weapon had penetrated German armor that had been considered invincible just minutes before. He could see the American tank commander standing in his cupola, studying the hole his gun had punched through the Tiger's frontal plate with what looked like professional satisfaction. "Intelligence was wrong," Klaus said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the crackling flames consuming his tank. "The Americans have been keeping secrets." As they began their withdrawal through the forest, moving from tree to tree with the practiced stealth of men who had learned that survival depended on invisibility, Klaus couldn't stop thinking about what he'd witnessed. If the Americans had tank destroyers mounting 90-millimeter guns, guns powerful enough to penetrate Tiger armor at combat ranges, then every assumption the German army had made about armored warfare was suddenly obsolete. Behind them, the Tiger continued to burn, sending a column of black smoke into the gray December sky. It would serve as a beacon for other German units in the area, a warning that the rules of the game had changed. But Klaus wondered how many more Tigers would have to burn before that message reached the men who needed to hear it most. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing a battlefield that looked no different from 1,000 others Klaus had seen in 3 years of war. But something fundamental had changed in the space of that brief engagement. The Americans had unveiled a weapon that could kill German heavy tanks with impunity, and they had kept it secret until the moment of truth. As Klaus and his crew made their way deeper into the forest, moving toward the rallying point where they hoped to find transport back to friendly lines, he found himself wondering what other secrets the Allies were keeping, what other unpleasant surprises were waiting for tank crews who still believed in German technical superiority. The war was changing, Klaus realized, and not in Germany's favor. 3 days before the encounter that would shatter his understanding of modern warfare, Oberfeldwebel Klaus Richter had been writing a letter to his sister Greta in Munich. The words came slowly in the flickering candlelight of the abandoned farmhouse where his crew had taken shelter, each sentence a careful balance between honesty and hope. "Liebste Greta," he wrote, his gloved fingers cramped around the pencil stub. "The Belgian countryside reminds me of the hills around Papa's farm, though the fields here lie fallow and broken. I think often of home, of the smell of Mama's bread baking on Sunday mornings, of the sound of church bells across the valley." Klaus paused, listening to the distant rumble of artillery fire that had become as constant as breathing. How could he tell his sister about the dreams that woke him every night, visions of burning tanks and screaming men? How could he describe the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, or the hollow feeling in his chest when he realized he could no longer remember his father's voice. Friedrich sat across from him, methodically cleaning the breech mechanism of their tank's main gun with the obsessive care of a man who understood that mechanical precision was often the only thing standing between life and death. "You know," Friedrich said without looking up from his work, "my Eva writes that they're rationing everything now. Coffee, meat, even bread. She jokes about it in her letters, calls it victory diet, but I can read between the lines." Klaus nodded, setting aside his letter. Friedrich rarely talked about his wife back in Stuttgart, a seamstress who worked 14-hour days in a factory that had been converted to producing uniform cloth for the army. But when he did speak of her, his weathered face took on an expression of such tender vulnerability that it made Klaus's chest ache with loneliness. Hans emerged from beneath our tiger, his uniform streaked with grease and his boyish face creased with concentration. At 19, he was the youngest member of our crew, a farm boy from Schleswig-Holstein who had been drafted straight from his father's fields. Hans possessed an almost supernatural understanding of mechanical systems, able to diagnose engine problems by the sound of a misfire or the vibration in the driver's controls. "Transmission's holding up better than I expected," Hans reported, wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag. "But we're going to need new road wheels soon. The rubber is wearing thin, and I can hear the bogie wheels grinding." Klaus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. As tank commander, every decision filtered through him: when to engage, when to retreat, how to conserve ammunition and fuel, how to keep his crew alive for one more day. It was a burden that had aged him beyond his 23 years, carving lines around his eyes and threading silver through his dark hair. "We'll request replacement parts at the next supply depot," Klaus said, though they all knew that spare parts were becoming as scarce as hope itself. The German supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, constantly harassed by Allied fighters and partisan saboteurs. Tank crews learned to cannibalize disabled vehicles and make do with improvised repairs.
The farmhouse they had commandeered bore the scars of war like an old soldier. Artillery fragments had peppered the stone walls, and the windows were boarded up with rough planks. The original occupants, a Belgian family named Dubois, according to the letters Klaus had found scattered in the kitchen, had fled weeks ago, leaving behind only the detritus of interrupted lives: children's toys, family photographs, a woman's lace gloves forgotten on the mantelpiece. Klaus had made it a rule never to touch the personal belongings they found in abandoned houses. It was a small gesture of respect, perhaps, or maybe superstition. He told himself that somewhere the Dubois family was waiting to return to their home, to reclaim their interrupted lives. The alternative, that they had joined the countless refugees trudging westward ahead of the advancing armies, was too depressing to contemplate. "Do you ever think about what we're fighting for anymore?" Hans asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the kind of question that could get a man shot for defeatism, but the bonds forged between tank crew members transcended military discipline. In the confines of their steel fortress, they were less soldiers than brothers, bound together by shared terror and mutual dependence. Friedrich looked up from his cleaning, his expression carefully neutral. "We're fighting for each other," he said simply. "For the man beside you, for the crew that depends on you, for the right to go home when this is over." It was a safe answer, the kind of response that wouldn't draw unwanted attention from the political officers who occasionally appeared to assess unit morale. But Klaus heard the deeper truth in Friedrich's words. They weren't fighting for the fatherland anymore, or for the party, or for the grandiose promises of Lebensraum and racial destiny. They were fighting because stopping meant dying, and dying meant abandoning the men who had become their only family. Klaus picked up a photograph from the kitchen table, a formal portrait of the Dubois family taken in happier times. The father wore a suit that had been mended and remended, the mother held an infant in christening clothes, and 3 older children stood solemnly beside them. They looked like any family Klaus might have seen in any German town before the war. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, united by bonds of love and hope and shared dreams. "Sometimes I wonder what they think of us," Klaus said, still looking at the photograph. "The families whose homes we occupy, whose countries we've invaded. Do they see us as monsters, or just as young men caught up in something larger than ourselves?" Hans shrugged, his attention focused on the mechanical puzzle of their tank's final drive. "My father always said that soldiers don't start wars, they just finish them. Politicians and generals decide when the shooting starts. Men like us just try to survive long enough to go home." It was a philosophy that had sustained Klaus through 3 years of combat, through the heady victories in France and the grinding attrition on the Eastern Front. But lately, he found himself questioning assumptions that had seemed unshakable. The reports filtering back from Germany painted a picture of a homeland under constant bombardment, cities reduced to rubble, civilians living in cellars and subway tunnels. Was this the victory they had been promised? Friedrich reassembled his weapon with practiced efficiency, each component sliding into place with the precision of a Swiss watch. "You know what I think about?" he said, his voice taking on the contemplative tone of a man sharing a secret. "I think about the garden Eva planted behind our house. Tomatoes, beans, carrots, simple things, but she tends them with such care. In her letters, she writes about harvesting seeds for next year's planting, as if she's certain there will be a next year, a time when I'll come home and we'll work in that garden together." Klaus felt something twist in his chest, a combination of envy and admiration for Friedrich's ability to hold on to hope. Klaus had no wife waiting for him, no garden to tend, no future that extended beyond the next day's combat. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of their Tiger tank, 5 men enclosed in steel, moving across a landscape of devastation with no clear destination. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the evening air, the distinctive growl of German engines that Klaus recognized as a supply convoy. Hans immediately began gathering his tools, while Friedrich secured his weapon and Klaus stuffed the unfinished letter to his sister into his jacket pocket. Their brief respite was over. Tomorrow would bring another day of combat, another chance to test their skills against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger while Germany grew weaker. Klaus had learned not to think too far ahead, to focus on the immediate tasks of survival and duty that gave structure to chaos. But as they prepared to rejoin their unit, Klaus couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, not just for Germany, but for young men like themselves who had staked their lives on assumptions that were proving increasingly fragile. The war was changing around them, and Klaus wasn't sure they were changing fast enough to survive it. The convoy rolled past their hiding place, a mixture of half-tracks and trucks loaded with ammunition, fuel, and replacement parts. Klaus watched the faces of the drivers and guards, noting the same expression of grim endurance that he saw in his own mirror each morning. They were all caught in the same inexorable machinery of war, grinding forward toward an end that none of them could clearly envision. Outside, the Belgian night was clear and cold, filled with stars that seemed impossibly distant from the earthbound struggles of men and machines. Klaus wondered if Greta could see the same stars from her window in Munich, if she thought of him when she looked up at the vast darkness. The thought gave him a small measure of comfort, a sense of connection that transcended the immediate realities of war. Friedrich finished packing his equipment and looked up at Klaus with an expression that mixed resignation with determination. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "we face it together. That's all any of us can do." Klaus nodded, knowing that Friedrich was right. In a world where everything seemed uncertain, the bonds between crew members remained solid. They would fight together, endure together, and if necessary, die together. It was a grim kind of comfort, but it was better than facing the darkness alone. The intelligence briefing took place in what had once been the mayor's office in the small Belgian town of Marche-en-Famenne, now serving as temporary headquarters for what remained of the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion. Major Wilhelm Brenner stood before a map of the Ardennes region, his usually immaculate uniform showing the wear of constant field operations. Behind him, red pins marked known enemy positions, while black pins indicated German units, a depressing ratio that told its own story about the balance of forces. Klaus sat with the other tank commanders in mismatched chairs salvaged from the bombed-out building, listening to Brenner's measured voice describe a situation that grew more desperate by the hour. Around him, faces that had once shown the confidence of elite panzer troops now reflected the hollow-eyed exhaustion of men who had seen too much defeat. "Gentlemen," Brenner began, his voice carrying the crisp authority of an officer who refused to acknowledge the hopelessness of their situation. "Intelligence indicates that the Americans have committed significant armored reserves to contain our offensive. We can expect to encounter elements of the 7th Armored Division, the 9th Armored Division, and multiple independent tank destroyer battalions." Klaus exchanged glances with Oberfeldwebel Georg Steiner, commander of Tiger 312, and Klaus's closest friend among their surviving officers. Georg had lost his left eye to shrapnel at Kursk, and the leather eye patch gave him a piratical appearance that belied his gentle nature. Before the war, Georg had been a mathematics teacher in a gymnasium in Dresden, a man more comfortable with theorems than tank battles. "Sir," Georg raised his hand with the formal politeness that survived even in desperate circumstances. "What can you tell us about enemy anti-tank capabilities? We've received conflicting reports about new weapons systems." Brenner consulted his notes, though Klaus suspected the major knew far less than he pretended. Intelligence had become increasingly unreliable as German reconnaissance capabilities diminished under constant Allied air superiority. The Americans continued to field the M10 Wolverine with its 3-inch gun and the M18 Hellcat with a 76mm gun. Both are dangerous but manageable at proper engagement ranges. Klaus felt a nagging unease, remembering conversations with wounded tank crews who had described encounters with American tank destroyers that didn't match the official descriptions. But questioning intelligence reports too vigorously could be interpreted as defeatism, and defeatism could be a capital offense. "What about the new models?" asked Oberfeldwebel Franz Weber, commander of Tiger 318. Franz was a Bavarian giant whose massive frame barely fit in a tank commander's position, a former blacksmith who could bend steel with his bare hands, but possessed an artist's sensitivity to the nuances of armored combat. Brenner's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. There have been unconfirmed reports of experimental vehicles, but nothing that should concern experienced Tiger crews. Our 88mm guns remain superior to any weapon the Americans can field, and our armor protection is unmatched. It was the standard reassurance, the kind of confidence-building rhetoric that officers were expected to provide. But Klaus noticed that Brenner didn't meet their eyes when he said it, and the major's hands showed the slight tremor that came with too much coffee and too little sleep. The briefing continued, with details about supply lines, ammunition allocation, and rules of engagement that seemed increasingly irrelevant to the realities of combat. Klaus found his attention drifting to the windows, where he could see Belgian civilians moving through the rubble-strewn streets with the careful purpose of people who had learned to navigate between competing armies. An old woman pushed a wheelbarrow filled with salvaged belongings, her face set in lines of stoic endurance that reminded Klaus of his grandmother. Two children played a game with wooden sticks and stones, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the distant rumble of artillery. A priest in a worn cassock moved among the civilians, offering what comfort he could to families whose lives had been upended by forces beyond their control. Klaus wondered what these people thought of the German soldiers who had occupied their town. Did they see liberators or conquerors? Did they understand the political complexities that had brought foreign armies to their doorstep? Or did they simply view all soldiers as harbingers of destruction? Which brings us to operational priorities, Brenner was saying. The objective is to maintain pressure on Allied forces while conserving our strength for the main offensive. Avoid unnecessary risks, preserve ammunition, and report any unusual enemy activity immediately. The meeting concluded with the ritual exchange of salutes and the distribution of reconnaissance reports that would be obsolete within hours. Klaus gathered his maps and notes, preparing to return to his crew and the endless cycle of maintenance, movement, and combat that defined their existence. As the commanders filed out of the makeshift briefing room, Georg fell into step beside Klaus. "What do you think?" he asked quietly, his one good eye scanning the faces of passing soldiers for signs of morale collapse. "I think we're being fed fairy tales," Klaus replied, keeping his voice low. "The Americans aren't stupid. If they're committing armored reserves to this sector, they're bringing their best weapons, not museum pieces from 1942. Georg nodded grimly. "I've been thinking the same thing. Too many good crews have gone missing lately, and the survivors are reporting things that don't match the intelligence summaries." They walked in companionable silence through streets that bore the scars of multiple occupations. Buildings showed damage from different armies and different campaigns, bullet holes from 1940, bomb craters from Allied air raids, fresh shell damage from the current fighting. The architecture of war layered upon itself like geological strata, each conflict adding its own mark to the landscape. Klaus's crew was waiting beside their Tiger in what had once been the town square, now transformed into an impromptu motor park. Hans was underneath the tank again, his mechanical intuition drawing him to problems that less gifted drivers would miss until catastrophic failure occurred. Friedrich sat on a supply crate, writing in the journal he maintained with the methodical precision of a born record-keeper. "What's the word, Klaus?" asked Unteroffizier Dieter Koch, the crew's radio operator at Loader. Dieter was a Berlin street kid who had learned to survive on wit and audacity, qualities that served him well in the chaotic environment of tank warfare. His ability to maintain radio communications under the most difficult conditions had saved their lives more than once. "Standard mission parameters," Klaus replied, settling onto the Tiger's front slope to review his maps. "Patrol Sector 7 Alpha, engage targets of opportunity, avoid decisive engagement with superior forces." Hans slid out from underneath the tank, his uniform even more oil-stained than usual. "Final drive's making strange noises," he reported, with a concerned expression of a doctor discussing a favorite patient's health. "Nothing critical yet, but we should keep the speed down and avoid sharp turns." Klaus nodded, adding mechanical limitations to the growing list of factors that constrained their tactical options. The Tiger was a magnificent weapons system when properly maintained, but it was also a complex machine that required constant attention from skilled technicians. As spare parts became scarce and maintenance time shortened, even minor problems could cascade into mission-killing failures. Friedrich closed his journal and looked up at the cloudy sky. "Weather's changing," he observed, with the farmer's instinct for atmospheric conditions that had made him such an effective gunner. "Snow tonight, probably heavy. That will slow down air operations, but make movement difficult." Klaus studied the tactical situation, weighing their capabilities against the mission requirements. They had fuel for perhaps 50 kilometers of movement, ammunition for a sustained engagement, and a crew whose skills had been honed by 3 years of constant combat. Against that, They faced an enemy of unknown strength, equipped with weapons of uncertain capability, operating in terrain that favored defenders over attackers. "We'll move out at first light," Klaus decided. "Hans, I want you to baby that transmission. Friedrich, double-check the gun elevation mechanism. The cold weather has been causing problems with the hydraulics. Dieter, make sure we have spare batteries for the radio sets." The crew dispersed to their individual preparations with the practiced efficiency of men who had learned to function as a single organism. Klaus remained on the Tiger's front slope, studying his maps by the fading daylight and trying to anticipate the challenges that tomorrow would bring. Around him, the 501 Heavy Tank Battalion prepared for another day of combat with the methodical thoroughness that had made German armored forces legendary. Tank crews checked and rechecked their equipment, mechanics worked by lamplight to repair battle damage, and supply personnel distributed ammunition and fuel with the careful attention of men who knew that shortages could mean defeat. But beneath the surface efficiency, Klaus sensed an undercurrent of doubt that hadn't been there in the early days of the war. Too many battles had been fought against increasing odds. Too many good men had died for objectives that were abandoned before the blood had dried. The Wehrmacht was still a formidable fighting force, but it was a machine running on momentum rather than hope. As darkness settled over the Belgian countryside, Klaus climbed into his Tiger's commander's position and began the routine of equipment checks that would occupy the next hour. Every switch, every control, every instrument had to be verified as functional before they could consider themselves ready for combat. Through his periscope, he watched German sentries taking their positions around the perimeter of the motor park. Young faces, mostly. Replacements who had been rushed through abbreviated training programs as the demand for soldiers exceeded the supply of experienced men. They carried their weapons with the awkwardness of one more tool.
Awkward uncertainty of recruits, lacking the intuitive familiarity with violence that came only through surviving multiple engagements. Klaus wondered how many of these boys would be alive in a week, how many would live to see Germany again. War had become a grinding mill that consumed young men with mechanical efficiency, processing hope and courage into statistics and casualty reports. The mathematics were inexorable. Every day of combat reduced their numbers, while Allied strength continued to grow. But such thoughts were luxuries that tank commanders couldn't afford. Klaus focused on the immediate tasks of leadership, the countless small decisions that kept his crew alive and effective. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, and he would meet them with the professionalism that had sustained him through campaigns from France to Russia to Belgium. Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall, dusting the scarred landscape with a layer of white that would temporarily hide the wounds of war. In a few hours, the battlefield would be transformed into something that might almost be beautiful, if one could forget the violence that had shaped it. The morning after Klaus's encounter with the mysterious American tank destroyers, the survivors of the 501st Heavy Tank Battalion gathered in the shell-damaged church of Marché-en-Famenne. What had begun as a routine after-action briefing had evolved into something approaching a crisis of confidence, as crew after crew reported encounters with enemy weapons that defied all previous intelligence assessments. Major Brenner stood at the altar where Belgian priests had once delivered sermons of hope and redemption, but the message he carried was far grimmer. Behind him, a crude tactical map showed the positions of German units, with red X's marking the locations where Tigers had been lost in the past 48 hours. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever German heavy tanks encountered the new American tank destroyers, the results were catastrophic. "Gentlemen," Brenner began, his voice echoing in the vaulted space, "we are facing a fundamental shift in the balance of armored warfare. What we thought we knew about American anti-tank capabilities appears to have been incomplete. Klaus sat in a damaged pew beside Friedrich, Hans, and Dieter, listening to testimonies that corroborated his own terrifying experience. One by one, tank commanders who had survived encounters with the new American weapons described vehicles that mounted guns capable of penetrating Tiger armor at ranges that should have been safe. Hauptfeldwebel Steiner raised his hand, the leather patch over his missing eye giving him an expression of permanent grimness. "Sir, can we confirm the caliber of these new weapons? My crew observed what appeared to be 90mm guns, but that contradicts everything we've been told about American production capabilities." Brenner's face was ashen as he consulted his reports. "Confirmed, Gary. The Americans have been secretly deploying M36 tank destroyers, vehicles mounting 90mm guns with penetration capabilities exceeding our previous estimates." Klaus felt the weight of revelation settle over the assembled crews like a funeral shroud. The invincible Tiger, Germany's apex predator of armored warfare, had met its match in weapons the enemy had kept hidden until the crucial moment. "What are our orders, sir?" Klaus asked, though he dreaded the answer. "We adapt or we die," Brenner replied simply. "New tactics, maximum standoff ranges, and prayer that our engineering corps can respond before we lose every Tiger in the battalion." Outside, snow continued to fall on a battlefield where the rules had fundamentally changed. The age of German armored supremacy was ending, one burning Tiger at a time.